It's my pleasure to introduce to you Chris Beard and Sandra Olsen. Chris Beard is a paleontologist with expertise on the ecological implications of climate change, especially in the fossil and archaeological records. Sandra Olsen is an archaeologist with expertise on the ancient interactions between humans and animals. Both Olsen and Beard are also museum professionals with experience and expertise transforming technical, scientific results into formats that are attractive to broad public audiences. So first up is Chris, and then Sandra will be speaking after him, and we'll have questions after they've both spoken. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot for coming out today. Our photographer, Dick Bryant, is in Egypt right now, and so he obviously is not able to be here with us. But just let me tell you a little bit about the genesis of this project. My wife and co-author for this talk, Sandra Olsen, went to Saudi Arabia more than a year ago for the first time, and met with members of the government over there. Sandy at the time was working on a project about the origins of Arabian horses. It turned out that one of the princes that Sandy met with has three passions. One is photography, a second one is petroglyphs in Saudi Arabia, and a third one is Arabian horses. And so this was kind of a match made in heaven. And so we were invited to come to Saudi Arabia in January of this year and to do the first documentation of ancient rock art sites in the kingdom. And we went to several different parts of the kingdom, as I'll explain in a moment. Why do this? The scientific questions are very interesting, mainly for Sandy, less for me. But it is interesting, actually, from even a biodiversity or paleontology perspective, because it turns out that you can chart declines in biodiversity in Saudi Arabia through the Holocene since the last ice age based on petroglyphs. And it, of course, corresponds with dramatic climate change, desertification, aridification of the Arabian Peninsula. I think from the Saudi perspective, though, it was interesting for them to do this project, at least for a couple of reasons. One is they're well aware that their economy today is quite monopolized by petrodollars, and they're interested in diversifying like many other Middle Eastern economies are. And believe it or not, tourism is something that they're interested in pursuing in the future. And so the Ministry of Antiquities and Tourism gave us a lot of help, lent us one of the world's leading experts on petroglyphs to join us. We also, I think there are many reasons to do this kind of documentation, not just for preservation of the sites themselves, but also public outreach, distance learning, things like that. And some of that has already started, and Sandy will explain a lot about that in the second half of the talk. So I'm gonna stand in for our photographer Dick Bryant and give you a few technical photographic aspects of the challenges that we faced and some of the solutions that we came up with, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about from my perspective why these petroglyphs are interesting as someone who's interested in ancient fauna and faunal change through time, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sandy, and she'll talk about the archaeology and some of the public outreach programs that we've already done. This is a map of Saudi Arabia showing the places that actually have these densely packed petroglyph sites. We went more or less all around the kingdom. The one area that we didn't really go to was the Rub al-Khali, the so-called empty quarter in the southeastern part of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But everywhere else, most other parts of the kingdom we did visit. Okay, this is an example. I'm going to give you quick examples of some of the kinds of Gigapans that we took in these different areas. And this one, those of you who went to the museum reception last night, you're familiar with this one. It was one that was featured in the gallery. So this is near Juba in northern Saudi Arabia, not so far from Hayil. Just to the southwest of Juba, in a wadi out in the desert out there, is a place called Shwemas, and this is one example of a Gigapan that we took out there. By the way, I'm not showing you live versions that are off the Gigapan website. These are simply JPEGs of the Gigapans, and so of course you can zoom in on these on the website live, and so you guys can do that at your leisure later on. In southern Saudi Arabia, not far from the border with Yemen, this is a Gigapan at a place called Birhima. And not too far west of Riyadh, a very interesting and kind of isolated site there called Graffiti Rocks. So these are just some quick examples to show you some of the sites that we visited. Let me talk very quickly now about some of the technical issues related to photography. And I don't know how many photographers are in the room. All of you guys are superseding me very rapidly in your expertise, so I'm basically going to read some notes that our photographer Richard Bryant provided to us about some of the technical aspects of the photography that we did. Most of the Gigapans that we did were taken with the Epic 100 and a Canon G10 camera because of ease of use and quick setup time. Because of rapidly changing light at both dawn and dusk, sometimes it was critical to get the Gigapan set up really quickly, and the Epic 100 is really good for that. We also used the Pro version of the Gigapan, which at that time was a prototype. It was a lot heavier to maneuver, and it took longer to set up. With the Epic Pro, we used either the Canon 1DS Mark III or the Canon 5D Mark II, both of which are full-frame 21-megapixel cameras. The most commonly used lens was the Canon 300mm f4, but we also used the Canon 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. These two lenses are among the sharpest lenses available. The biggest problem we had in the field was the difference in depth of field between the small format G10 and the full frame camera with the 300mm lens. Whereas the G10 with its lens fully extended to the equivalent of 100mm at f8 was acceptably sharp from 5 feet to infinity, the 300mm lens had a much shallower depth of field, not enough to render objects 30 feet away and at infinity, both sharply in focus even at f18. The memory cards were downloaded to a MacBook Pro as often as possible and copied onto 2 portable hard drives. Each night the photographs were reviewed and several of the Gigapans were stitched together with the Gigapan Stitcher program. One of the great things about the Stitcher program is that it only works on several of the individual photographs at one time, so it does not place too great of a burden on a laptop. Even Gigapans of several hundred photographs can easily be stitched on a laptop. When we returned to the US, a newer version of the stitching program was available and it was used for the final panoramics. Our cameras were set up to record images both in RAW and JPEG formats. The JPEGs were shot primarily as backup for the RAW images, but we also used the JPEGs nightly to stitch together our panoramics in a preliminary fashion. Sometimes Gigapans can be difficult to pre-visualize, so being able to review our Gigapans every night allowed us to make adjustments to our workflow for the following day. Although JPEGs contain the same number of pixels as the RAW files were relied upon for all of our final images because they contain much more color information per pixel. Yes, that means we were stitching together most Gigapans at least twice from the ground up. Not only are JPEGs compressed, but when they are compressed, the camera is making decisions about what information is thrown out. JPEGs are also 8-bit files, so they only have about 1/64th the amount of information that can be captured by a 14-bit camera. This information is important in recovering both the light areas in the sky while still retaining details in the darkest shadows of the photograph. Okay, so this is an image of the screen in Lightroom, and our workflow was to import the raw files into either Lightroom or Capture One and make adjustments to colors and exposures, and then synchronize all of the individual photographs that make up a Gigapan. Lightroom and Capture One are excellent tools for synchronizing hundreds of photographs so that they will have uniform color and exposure when they're stitched. Once the synchronization process is complete, the raw files are converted and exported as 16-bit TIFFs. The TIFFs are then stitched together using the Gigapan Stitcher program. Richard also wanted to mention that although the Stitcher is much more efficient than Photoshop, for example, at stitching together photographs, the one advantage that Photoshop has over the Stitcher program right now is that you can export 16-bit files, and he's kind of a purist on that, and so he's kind of hoping that a future version of the Stitcher will be able to export 16-bit files. All right. A lot of Gigapans, we've all noticed this phenomenon of vignetting, and it's one that we certainly faced as well. Because light passes more efficiently through the center of a camera lens, all lenses tend to vignette or darken the edges of the photographs. Normally this isn't noticeable, and if it is, it's usually a good thing because it makes the subject of the photograph brighter and it channels the viewer's interest into the photograph. However, of course, if you're stitching together large numbers of photographs, this leads to striping in the skies. So how can you correct for this? Lightroom and Capture One have adjustments to remove vignetting from photographs, and we've experimented with various settings in both of these programs, but neither does a good enough job that striping in uniform areas of the skies is completely eliminated. Even the slightest discontinuity in the evenness of the sky will result in striping. The only way that we've found to get a completely smooth sky is to use the clone tool in Photoshop. And so this is just a screen capture of the lens correction vignetting routine in Lightroom. Okay, now let's, with all these technical details about photography out of the way, let's move on and talk a little bit about petroglyphs and photography related to them. From a purely photographic point of view, there are basically two kinds of petroglyphs, at least in Saudi Arabia. The first are these deeply incised and generally Neolithic age petroglyphs. And photographically, these need to be shot at low incident angle lighting in order to bring out that depth. If you shoot these in open daylight, you're really not gonna see much detail at all. And so our challenge, of course, then was always to be at these remote petroglyph sites, either at the crack of dawn or at dusk. We found out that dusk was always a lot easier for our drivers to make. No matter how much prodding and how many promises, the crack of dawn just rarely ever happened. Now the opposite, or the other style of petroglyphs that one encounters in Saudi Arabia are far more recent. And these petroglyphs are not as deeply incised into the rock. And they mainly rely on the difference between the weathered, fully patinaed surface of the ancient rock and the unweathered, and in this case, lighter surface of the petroglyph itself. So because these aren't deeply etched or pecked petroglyphs, you don't have to shoot them with low incidental lighting. You can shoot them in open shade. This slide also makes an important geological observation that I want to talk about now. All of the petroglyphs in Saudi Arabia, I don't know about the whole world, but the ones I'm familiar with in the Four Corners region of the United States and in Saudi Arabia, they're uniformly done on sandstones, and you can tell, you see the cross bedding in the sandstone on this site behind me. And sandstone, it turns out, it has excellent characteristics in terms of hardness, in terms of weathering characteristics, to have a beautiful kind of vertical panel that can make an excellent palette for an ancient artist to work on. It's not as hard as granite, so it's much more workable. And so we find that uniformly sandstones are where petroglyph panels are developed in Saudi Arabia. Okay, just another little photography lesson that we learned when we were there. The image on these are two images of exactly the same petroglyph panel in Saudi Arabia. It's a petroglyph that we call the Queen. You can kind of tell that it's a female figurine, especially based on the right image, where you can actually see some detail. And the image on the left was shot in open shade, and the image on the right is night photography. And obviously, the night photography works much, much better. And just a few more technical details about how we did the night photography. The light sources that we tried included both halogen and LED flashlights as well as flash units. Flash units are desirable because they have daylight balanced color, but they're a bit harder to use because you can't see what they're doing as easily as with a continuous power source. Flashlights are really easy to use, but you have to make adjustments in Photoshop to accomplish the color balance. Standard halogen bulbs are really yellow, and LED lights are either blue or blue-green. Now, these images are not Gigapans. These are single-shot digital images. A goal that we may attempt to accomplish this next January in Saudi Arabia in a follow-up trip is to try to shoot night photography Gigapans. Obviously, one of the challenges that we're going to face is synchronizing synchronizing the flash systems with the exposures of each individual shot, so that we'll actually be able to stitch together the individual images. But we think that this is a really promising technique. It's one that I at least don't know of other people facing this issue yet. Just another image contrasting night photography on the right with open shade on the left, showing how much more detail you can pick up with the night photography. A couple of neat educational examples that one can use this kind of information to teach students about not just archaeology and paleontology, but normal geological and geomorphological processes. This is a large Gigapan panel at Gauta, not far from Juba in northern Saudi Arabia. We call it the split rock panel. As you can see, this is the actual image of what this petroglyph panel looks like today. But of course, with the miracle of Photoshop, you can reconstruct what the petroglyph panel looked like in antiquity when people actually placed all of these petroglyphs there. I'm going to zoom in now on the top part of this petroglyph panel, and you can tell that the image that looks possibly like an ostrich there on the right would have been perfectly contiguous with the human figures and the oryx figures to the lower left. So this is an example. This is actually at least moderately interesting for people that are interested in geomorphological processes, because what this tells us is that split in the rock postdates the petroglyphs. And I will give you an example later on where that's not the case. Okay, we're going to switch gears now to talk a little bit about changing environments and changing faunas in Saudi Arabia. Sandy will talk about the people. After the Ice Age, at the end of the Ice Age, about 12,000 years ago, Saudi Arabia and, in fact, much of North Africa was quite different than it is today. And, in fact, there was an interval called the Holocene wet phase from about 9,000 to 5,000 BCE, before the present, where that whole part of the world was much wetter than it is today, and the region supported much more diversified ecosystems as a result. Apparently, according to paleoclimatologists, this was because the monsoonal rains that currently operate in Central Africa migrated farther northward at that time, dropping a lot more precipitation on the Arabian Peninsula and what is now northern Africa. Of course, you know, the archaeological record of northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula reflects this. You find archaeological sites in places that today are virtually uninhabitable, by the end of this period, you had a southward retreat of that monsoonal rain pattern, so that the modern type of conditions appeared. Okay, this Gigapan actually shows, this is near Juba, and to the right you see the Holocene wet phase lake beds of an ancient lake that it's all the light-colored rocks that you see. It's actually also where all the date palms are right now. And it's no coincidence that many of the petroglyphs in this area were built right on the edge of the lake in this big sandstone mountain just adjacent to that ancient lake. This is a quick list of the diverse fauna that you find in petroglyphs on that wet phase, Holocene wet phase. What I only want to point out a couple of observations based on this. One is that most of these animals are African, and in fact, all of them are still alive except for one, that one in italics, Pelorovis, and I want to talk about that in more detail because it's an extinct critter. It's something that paleontologists are fascinated by. Okay. Pelorovis, it turns out Pelorovis was a dominant component of petroglyphs at all of the sites in central and northern Saudi Arabia that we saw dating to the Neolithic. This is an example, this particular individual petroglyph of Pelorovis. We kind of called it Babe the Blue Ox. This thing is 2 meters long at least, maybe larger. And so you can tell these giant horns. This was it was basically like a longhorn on steroids. This is another example of a petroglyph of Pelorovis, in this case from graffiti rocks not far from Riyadh. This is sandy next to a Pelorovis petroglyph from Schwemus. These Pelorovis petroglyphs are fascinating for a couple of reasons. One is that they're so numerically abundant. They're actually one of the more common elements, faunal elements that is shown in Neolithic petroglyphs in Saudi Arabia. This is what we know about Pelorovis from the fossil record. There are several species of them, including some that are known from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. They're very common in southern, eastern, and northern Africa. The oldest Pelorovis are about 2.5 million years ago, and apparently some of the youngest ones that are known in North Africa are only about 4,000 years BP. So these things became extinct not so long ago. Interestingly, one of the few fossil sites in Saudi Arabia from the An-Nafud Desert, which is very close to some of these petroglyphs, contains Pelorovis from the Pleistocene. Okay, so these giant things were there as fossils. Nobody knew how long they lasted, though, until we started finding these petroglyphs of Pelorovis, which prove that these animals survived well past the end of the Pleistocene in Saudi Arabia into the Neolithic wet phase. All right, so what are the implications of all of this? Well, first off, it augments the actual physical record of ancient animals in Saudi Arabia, and that's admittedly meager. So this is along what a paleontologist would refer to as a stratigraphic range extension of these animals, which otherwise are only known by a few bones and teeth from a Pleistocene locality. But it's important to bear in mind, if you're trying to do ancient biodiversity studies based on these petroglyphs, you're gonna be seriously biased. And the reason is that these ancient people that were making these petroglyphs apparently didn't care about rodents and rabbits and hyraxes. They drew, you know, like you can imagine, like many ancient artists, they drew all the big ugly animals, or the dangerous ones, the ones that they wanted to hunt, perhaps the ones that had magical or ritual qualities associated with them. And so you're getting a very biased view of what the ancient fauna of Saudi Arabia was based on petroglyphs. I already told you that these petroglyphs extend the fossil record of Pelorovis, but something to bear in mind, these petroglyphs in Saudi Arabia are one of the very, very rare examples of ancient human artists actually drawing a depiction of an extinct animal. Some of the only other examples that I know of are, for example, this image of an extinct Irish elk in the French Paleolithic cave of Lascaux. Okay, I'm going to wrap up because I'm running out of time, but this is another Gigapan image near Schwemus, and I just want to draw your attention to that fracture in the rock right there, because we actually took some high-definition videos on site that we want to embed in the Gigapan website as soon as that is available, because we think that it's going to enhance the educational value of the Gigapans themselves. And so let me just show you what we were able to show, or what we were able to do. Hopefully this will work. So the geological processes of erosion, fracturing, and slumping that have taken place through the millennia here at Schwemus complicate efforts to figure out what this would have looked like at the time the people were here making the petroglyphs. This example right beside me is a fairly easy one to reconstruct, because this block and this block remain close together and they fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So we can tell what they would have originally looked like. However, in some cases, giant blocks with petroglyphs on them like this have already fractured and slumped enough that they've tumbled actually downhill, so that today the petroglyphs themselves are depicted upside down and far away from where they were originally constructed. Our idea about the educational qualities of the website that we're constructing right now is that it will be bilingual, available both to Arabic speakers and to English speakers, and so we also recorded local guides. This is a Bedouin guide.
هذه المواقع الأثرية الكتابات هذه كتابة لا نعرف عنها سابقا، من كتبها وما هي تعني ما ندري حن يا بدو، ولكن نحن نقول هذا الأمم اللي قبلنا أو العرب اللي قبلنا اللي كتبوا هذه الأرض وين راحوا، مستغربين كيف هذه بقت وهم راحوا.
You get the idea. In any case, we think that embedding high-definition videos directly in these Gigapans is an excellent next step to enhance educational value and really leverage the Gigapans to the next level. So I'm going to turn things over right now to Sandy, who can speak more about this project with much more authority than I can. So Sandy, come on up.
Thank you very much for coming here today and giving up on all that beautiful sunshine and warm weather. Well, as you probably heard last night, and you will hear more tomorrow, Gigapan is an incredible method for archaeologists, and it has so much potential. We've only just begun to tap it. Of course, it's great for doing vast surveys where we want to show a large geographic landscape, but it's also useful for doing high-resolution close-ups of artifacts. So there are many, many things we can do with Gigapan. As Chris said, in January 2010, we went to Saudi Arabia to document petroglyphs there, and our colleague Majid Khan, who has worked there for 31 years, is our expert. And he has taken many photographs himself, but he is the first to admit that Gigapan surpasses the kinds of photographs he's been able to take. And so we went there as a reconnaissance to try to find out how applicable Gigapan would be to petroglyphs anywhere in the world. And I started out as a southwestern archaeologist, so I was somewhat familiar with petroglyphs in that region. And the second thing, of course, was to actually document the Saudi petroglyphs, because although Majid Khan has published many of these, there are new ones turning up all the time, and it is one of the richest regions in the world for rock art. So we feel we were successful on both counts, and so we're going back, hopefully, inshallah, in January to take even more photographs at several new localities. This time we'll be focusing more on finding images of horses, which is a topic I've studied since 1985, I guess, the relationship between horses and humans. And no one knows really when the horse first came into Saudi Arabia, so it's a very exciting subject for me. This is just a reminder of the sites that we worked at. And there are numerous benefits using Gigapan for rock art, but I'm just going to discuss a few of these in this brief lecture, and I'm sure some of you will be able to think of a few more. The old way of documenting petroglyphs requires that you take a number of different kinds of photographs. So you're going to have to take wide angles, you're going to have to take normal photographs, and you're going to have to take close-ups. This takes a lot of time, obviously, and it has disadvantages in that the wide-angle ones may not show you the kind of detail you need to see, and some of the areas may be out of focus or poorly lit. On the other hand, the close-up images, imagine trying to relate all of the little close-up images you would take of graffiti rocks to each other when you're back home. You have to map all that out. Or if you have to sit down and draw it while you're there in the field, which is what they used to do. It's very, very time-consuming, and time is money, and the lighting is constantly changing on you, so there's quite a disadvantage to the old methods. We're very lucky because we have such a great photographer to document these things, and then I can study them in my leisure back in my office. This is one of my favorite Gigapans, and Chris has already shown that to you, and it's just so incredible. It really was a beautiful location. But what's nice about the Gigapans is they really allow the archaeologist to take home that vision of what that landscape looked like. And of course, it may have changed, particularly from the wet phase to today, but we can still get an idea the rocks are generally in the same place. And we can reconstruct, particularly as Chris said here, you can see the lake over to the right-hand side, and the petroglyphs are right up against that rock face adjacent to the lake, suggesting that the people were probably camping at the lake margin and in the shelter of those rocks. So that made a very nice area for the artists to sit and work at their leisure. Of course, one of the great benefits to Gigapan is, for archaeologists is the same as it is for biologists and geologists, people in other fields, and that is that you can identify exact locations where you've taken the photograph fairly easily. If you have to return to those places, it can be actually pretty tricky, and that sounds kind of crazy, but in Berhema, near the Yemen border we're working at, It was very complicated to navigate. And here you see our Bedouin guide again. This man could have done weather on ABC every night. He was just a natural. I don't know if he'd ever been in front of a video camera before, but it's fantastic. And this man knew every square inch of that area. But as you can see from the satellite image, it was very complicated. When you started going up these individual wadis, you could get very easily turned around if you're not a Bedouin. And while we could never replace our Bedouin guides, having the ability to use the Gigapan to see large-scale landscapes and then to tie that in with our GPS readings, which we took at every location, and then to use Google Earth really helps us out significantly to become familiar with the landscape. Another advantage we had, of course, in having such a brilliant photographer as Richard Bryant is that he was able to capture the optimal lighting situation. And then I can sit in my dark, windowless office and look at my large screen on the computer. And for days, weeks, months, years, I have that image frozen with the optimal lighting. And if I'm sitting out there in the field, I can tell you this happened every day. The light would be just right, and then it wasn't so good. And so if I was trying to take notes, it was hopeless. So that's a real advantage for us. And the way that Richard did this is he would start out, we were only in each locality about 3 days. So he would try to go see as many places where he was going to take Gigapans as possible, early in the morning, as early as we could get going. And then figure out, based on the orientation of the rock face and if there were any other big rocks that would be in the way of the sunlight at a certain time of day, and also the technique that was used, whether it was deeply pecked and incised or just very shallow, what would be the best time of day to be there? And we made every effort to do that, to show up again at that site at the best time of day. Things do interfere, so it wasn't always possible. But in most cases, he really worked miracles. The other thing that's widely applicable and is really the strongest selling point, I think, of the Gigapan is that you have different scales that you can look at a particular image. So, of course, we can get the general view of what that rock face looked like in some of the landscape, and then we can zoom in, get a close-up of an individual scene, and see what was happening in that scene. Never mind what's happening all around it, but that particular scene. Then we can really zoom in, and it's amazing to me because he could be back so far getting that whole panorama in, and then when you zoom in, you can see the grains of sand in the sandstone. And that allows me to do a number of things, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but it's really good for showing manufacturing techniques. And it's easier for me to convince my colleagues when I have such beautiful images that I'm not just kind of making all this up. Now, one of the most frustrating things for archaeologists when it comes to petroglyphs is dating them. And we have two kinds of dating in archaeology. One is absolute chronological dating, where you can assign a date, 1492 or whatever. And the other one is relative dating, where you can say, well, this thing is older than that thing. For us, unfortunately, with petroglyphs, it's really difficult. You have to have just ideal circumstances to be able to assign an absolute chronological date. But what we can do is some relative dating. And everything tends to divide in these Saudi petroglyphs into two groups. One is from the wet phase, and the other one is after that point, any time from about 2500 to 3000 BC on up to even medieval times in some cases, or even more recent. So with relative dating, there are a number of things you can look at. You can look at the patina, because there's more patina on the older object. You can look at the subject matter. So for example, in the wet phase, you have hunters, and in the later phase, you have pastoralists. You can look at the manufacturing techniques, and you can see if images overlap. So just a list of criteria for the wet phase. We have either no patina or a slight patina, or the patina goes right down into the recessed areas. And that is because these were formed before you had a lot of desert varnish, before you had extensive desertification, causing that darker, thin layer of patina. And because they're generally, at the time they were made, there was no patina, the rock surface was all the same color, the artist had to very deeply incise or peck those images because there was no change in the color from the original surface to the deeper recessed areas. So they had to depend on the sun raking across to cast shadows. When we look at the scenes, we generally see hunters with bows or throwing sticks or clubs, and they hunted with packs of dogs. The dogs are kind of interesting. They look like pariah dogs. They have little curly tails and spiked ears and thin waists. And it's interesting to see, as you see here with the Pelorovis, the kinds of, the attitudes of the dogs. You know, you can see they're mostly males. And the way they're focusing, they're kind of watching the hunter and what he's doing. So we can see these scenes. We also have extinct Pelorovis and many more kinds of African fauna than you see in the later period. In the later period, the people have switched their economy. They're now camel herders. So they're nomads still, but they're nomadic herders rather than hunters. And you see lots of camels, some ancient Arabic script, and some tribal symbols, which they still use today, carved into the rocks, and things like date palms, which they were very dependent on and still are today. We also see, after about 900 BCE, lots of infantry and cavalry, lots of battle scenes. So here you can see a beautiful camel scene, and it's also got lots of riding and horses and so forth. And here you see a man actually trying to control the camel, so you know that's very different from these hunter scenes. But up in the right-hand corner, you can see an ibex, and it looks like a dog is attacking that ibex. So this is a much older image, and you can tell that too because the patina is darker. It's maybe not as old as the Neolithic wet phase, but it's older than that camel. And this one's very interesting because you can actually see cattle and a dog underneath the neck of the camel. So this kind of overlapping is another way we can do relative dating within a given panel. So that's what we have so far. It's very preliminary. There's much more work to be done, obviously. And when we go back, we're going to explore about 6 new sites. We are finding new things all the time. This beautiful panel that you see here was discovered by my colleague Majid Khan while we were sitting resting at lunchtime, and I'm really embarrassed. He asked me if I wanted to go, and I didn't. And he and that wonderful Bedouin guide discovered this, so it's a really remarkable panel. So we're going to go back. We're going to try to locate every horse we can find because the people that who are supporting this research are quite interested in that topic, and I am too, of course. And we're going to try night gigapans. In fact, what we're going to try to do is just go out in the late afternoon, do night gigapans, 3D laser imaging, and polynomial texture mapping, all of which have to be done in the dark. And so we'll be stumbling over the rocks as we go. And then we're going to use a lot more satellite images to help us really navigate and get a better understanding of the landscape that the people, the ancient people, were moving along through. And I guess because we're in a museum and because we're actually working for the Minister of Education in Saudi Arabia, and maybe it's just the way we think, but we're really wanting to push forward with informal science education. The political climate being what it is today after this recent election, we're reminded how important it is that we reach out, not just to our colleagues, but also to the public at large and particularly the youth, and try to show them our methods and our conclusions in terms of scientific research. So we have 3 things that we're working on. One is exhibiting Gigapan petroglyphs images, and we've already done that, and we're going to do more of it at the Carnegie, and developing this website that will be independent and will use Gigapans. And then we're going to try to do some distance learning, maybe have classrooms here in the U.S. doing some Gigapans of their own area, and then the Saudi children can do the same thing. So it'll work both ways. They can learn about their different countries that way and become acquainted. So we've already had some success with having Richard's Gigapans up on display in Kentucky. You may have heard of the World Equestrian Game. So at the very entrance of the exhibit in the International Museum of the Horse, we had one of his Gigapans from Berhema. And also this enormous panel was 18-foot long exhibit, photo mural. And Randy Sargent here at CMU was incredibly helpful to us because he built a standalone computer interactive station that was very successful there. It did everything that the Gigapan website did without the risks of having children getting into websites and doing whatever they want to do with it. So it worked beautifully. And we hope by February we will have a website up that will talk about our research. It's called Stories in the Rocks, and that will give the different sites and the information available there, and also some of our videos, lists of publications, and places where they can go to museums and see Gigapans on exhibit. And then finally, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History does distance learning, and we've participated in that. I've taught a class in Alaska in our distance learning office, and we want to do that with Gigapans. So we're hoping to put the Gigapans, the videos, myself standing there talking, or Chris, or Richard, our photographer, and maybe some actual artifacts. And then have that distance learning. It can go anywhere in the world, really. I'm hoping we can do some of them actually in Saudi Arabia. So we are looking forward to going back, and we're going to take Richard. Fortunately, we couldn't do it without him. He's very excited about going back. And Majid, who you can see in the right-hand corner there. Majid is, 73, I think now, and very fit, and very able to go just about anywhere, and certainly is totally, his heart is right there in Saudi Arabia and the petroglyphs. He's very excited to continue this research. I really want to thank the Fine Foundation and CMU's Create Lab and their wonderful team for everything they've done to make this possible for us. So thank you.
If anybody has questions for either Sandra or me.
How are you powering your 3D scanner?
How are you going to power your 3D scanner?
Oh. Well, I used to work, well, still do work occasionally in Kazakhstan. My colleague, who is still continuing very actively working in Kazakhstan. When I've worked in Kazakhstan, we've had a number of different ways. We have generators, or we have just take a car battery, and we've powered all of our equipment that way. So that's probably what we do. We have lots of cars around there. We usually have about 9 vehicles, because we've got security and police and intelligence and everybody with us. So we'll have plenty of power, I think. We'll be okay. Yeah?
Is there a worldwide database of rock art?
There are lots. There are lots of, I don't know if there's a whole database on rock art, but there are lots and lots of websites. Usually, some of them are just geographically, Australia or South Africa or something, but others cross over. I can't say whether there is or not. You can just keep looking forever on these. There should be, but it would be enormous. But there are a lot of different sites that certainly cover the whole world. Yes.
On the Elarovis question, first of all, I'll ask just a general question, then I'm going to try to be devil's advocate a little bit, from my perspective. First question is there any genetic relationship between Pelerogus and sort of Bos primigenius? And if there is or isn't, that's sort of one question. And if there is it possible that those are not Pelerogus and in fact they're Bos primigenius?
Yes, Michael, and we've had the same argument. So Michael, I don't know if you could hear him, Michael Frachetti, who works in Kazakhstan, is asking, are Pelerogus and Bos primigenius, the aurochs or the wild cattle, are they related? And could those images be Bos primigenius? And we're still struggling with that, actually.
Bovids are tough because their teeth are so uniform and skeletal anatomy is pretty uniform. But the critical thing is that current thinking about Pelerogus, I mean, Pelerogus probably needs systematic revision because some of the species of Pelerogus, like Oldowayensis, are thought to be closely related to Bos. And in fact, some people think that Bos, for those of you who don't speak Latin, is cattle. And so the Bos primigenius is the ancient aurochs, which is thought to be the ancestor of modern cattle. So some people believe that certain species of Pelerogus are probably related to Bos, but the interesting thing is that the only species of Pelerogus that, at least in North Africa, appears to have survived into the Holocene is Pelerogus antiquus. And Pelerogus antiquus is actually believed to be related to the modern Cape buffalo Sinceras. And that's the one that we think we have in petroglyphs in Saudi Arabia. If it's not that species, then it's a dramatic range extension from like early Pleistocene.
Just bringing it back to the question about kind of the world distribution of rock art. I mean, as you know, Sandy, I mean, there are images in Kazakhstan 5,000 to 10,000 kilometers away with those very similar kind of horn things. And of course, they're interpreted as aurochs, right?
I actually have a horn in my site. That I have two horns. One is Bos primigenius, and the other one is a meter long and much straighter. According to the people I know that know Bos primigenius, they don't think that there's any way it could be. But there's a lot of variability in horn shape. And they're actually, some of the North African cattle have, today, there are breeds that have 6-foot-long horn cores that are adapted to cooling. It's a vascularization of the horns that allow cooling. It's like a radiator. So the Ancole breed. So I'm not adamant on that being Pelerogus. They do have Pelerogus fossils in Saudi Arabia. And as far as I know, they don't have Bos. But, you know, they think that the Indian breed of cattle may have bred with the Gower. So I think it's kind of wobbly until you start doing DNA. And we don't have much in the way of bones preserved. Yes?
I noticed you had some hands. And hands, of course, are sexually dimorphic. So whose hands were they? Are they men or they women?
That's something, we have a colleague at Penn State who could tell more about that than I could. We have not done that study yet, but I'm very interested in doing that. Interestingly, Majid has a theory that all the hands and the feet are incredibly old, that they're Pleistocene. But, you know, I keep looking at my own hands and feet and I can't tell. But, no, you're right. We could do something with that, possibly. Yes. Okay, I think we better quit now, but thank you so much.